Hard Talk. I'm your host, Michael Delagrange. I have my esteemed guest today, the preeminent international criminal lawyer, Saeeda Verrall. Saeeda, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
What are some of the main characteristics of international investigations? Can you talk about the specific legal factors, contextual elements that need to be established?
Well, no two countries are alike and no two conflicts are alike, but there are certain characteristics that we see converge across various different international investigations and prosecutions. The first one is the sheer scale or vastness of the crimes. We're often talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of victims and affected persons. And often the crimes take place across a varied and wide geographical area. The second is that often these investigations are taking place while crimes are still occurring and conflict is still at play. So that has implications for the ability of investigators to access the area and also to speak freely and safely with witnesses without putting them at risk. So those are some of the factors at play and some of the common challenges. And they also inform the types of evidence that might be used in international criminal investigations as well. Turning to the contextual elements, these are the legal elements that need to be proven to establish, for instance, crimes against humanity or war crimes. These are the legal elements that distinguish the difference between killing as a domestic crime and, for instance, killing as a crime against humanity. So crimes against humanity must be committed in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against any civilian population. And at the International Criminal Court, there's an extra requirement that this happens pursuant to a state or organizational policy. Now, there's also a mens rea or mental requirement, and that is that the perpetrator of the crime has the knowledge and intention not only for the crime that they are committing, but also in relation to those wider contextual factors. Turning to war crimes must occur in the context of an armed conflict, and there must be a nexus or a connection to that armed conflict. And again, there's a mental element that requires that the individual not only has the awareness or intent for the crime they're committing, but also the awareness and the intent concerning the broader conflict. Looking at that a little bit closer, armed conflicts can be broken down into two types: international armed conflicts between states and non-international armed conflicts, which might be between a state's army and another organized armed group, or between two or more organized armed groups. So even before we get to proving individual international crimes, a substantial amount of evidence needs to be produced to prove those contextual factors.
What, in your opinion, is the role of open source information in the investigation and prosecution of international crimes?
With the proliferation in digital media and user-generated content, open source information plays an increasingly vital and important role in international investigations and prosecutions. And we see this right through from the beginning of an investigation through to the courtroom. In the early stages, particularly in light of some of the challenges of international investigations that I spoke of earlier, open source information is often the most readily available information that is available in real time. So this can often inform the early stages of an investigation. It allows investigators to get an initial understanding of what is happening and where, which can then inform their next investigative steps. Open source information is also very important for lead generation. And that means looking at the open source and asking ourselves, what is the next step behind this? Who posted this video? Do we want to speak to them? Looking forward to prosecutions, we increasingly see that open source information and open source analysis or intelligence is being used to prove crimes. And this ranges from, for instance, videos or imageries that show crimes taking place, but also open source information that contains utterances by perpetrators, which can be used to show their knowledge or intent.
What are some of the key considerations for the use of open source information in proving international crimes?
When we talk about introducing open source information and evidence, the key consideration is really going to be its reliability. Is a judge or another fact finder able to say, this piece of information or evidence is what it purports to be, it shows what it purports to show? And there are a number of factors that can go into establishing reliability. These range from the initial way that open source information is collected. Is it preserved or downloaded using appropriate software that makes sure it's captured in a complete way and preserves the available metadata of the open source item? Is it stored in a secure way that can make us confident it wasn't subsequently manipulated or changed? We also talk a lot about verification or authentication of open source information, and that can happen in numerous ways. Partly, open source information can be verified by looking at the indicia within that piece of information. For instance, does a video have a date and time stamp on it that can help us understand when it actually was taken? Does a photograph have embedded geolocation information that will tell us where it was taken? Moving forward to the next step, another part of verification or authentication is comparing one item of open source information against others. So where one video or photograph may not be particularly strong evidence in isolation, if we can compare it to others to match those geolocation information and potentially map it against satellite imagery, we come up with a much more comprehensive and reliable product for the courtroom.
How can domestic documentation actors and the media contribute to international accountability efforts?
Domestic documentation actors and the media can contribute to international accountability efforts in very significant ways. And one of the first and most important ways is simply publicizing their findings and drawing attention to these international crimes and atrocities, because often it's that media attention that will galvanize the international response and lead to further accountability efforts. One thing that domestic documentation actors and the media can think of in the very early stages is how the information that they're gathering could potentially be used in the long run for accountability, even if they don't know where that accountability forum may be and what form it would take. To give one very simple example, keeping track of the sources that they speak to, knowing the contact information for those sources, and asking those individuals if their contact information could be passed on to international or national accountability efforts. Journalists may also consider whether they would be approached as witnesses to these crimes, if it is safe for them to speak to what they saw and experienced. And that's because often they are the first people on the ground, and they also have very relevant evidence for international prosecutions.
What are some of the best practices when documenting violations of human rights that civilians or lawyers, human rights defenders or journalists should implement in their quest to contribute to justice and accountability? What are some best practices to ensure that the evidence collected can later be used in court?
Firstly, you've mentioned a wide range of actors there. So there is no universal playbook for how journalists or documentation actors or human rights defenders should go about documenting international crimes, because the context is always so different and the work that they're doing will be very different. However, there are some key considerations or principles that would apply in nearly all of these cases. And to be clear, these are the same principles that should also inform international investigators or prosecutors, and I'll mention two of those. The first is the principle of do no harm. We do not want to engage with individuals, whether they are victims or witnesses of crimes, and leave them in a worse place than we found them because of their engagement with us. Of course, an important aspect of this is their physical security. And often it's domestic documentation actors that will have the best understanding of the security situation on the ground, and they will be well placed to make these assessments. Another form of the do no harm principle is how we deal with potentially vulnerable persons. We need to take care, whether in domestic documentation or international investigations, not to cause more harm to vulnerable populations. And that could include, for instance, the kind of information we choose to elicit from victims of sexual violence, or also our engagement with children and young people. And I would say that incredible caution needs to be taken before eliciting information from children without the proper expertise.
What are some of the best practices to ensure that the evidence collected can later be used in court?
That's a very interesting question, and I think the operative words are how it could be used in court or how it could be useful, but not how it can be admissible. I think it's a trap for us to think that domestic documentation actors and other first responders will already be able to produce evidence that is going to be admissible in criminal proceedings. Because one, that's not their job. Two, they don't know at this point necessarily where this evidence will end up. So instead of thinking about admissibility, we can think about how evidence can be useful. It may not be the final form of evidence that is produced in the courtroom, but it will inform future investigators or prosecutors as to how they can choose to bring their case. One very simple factor is simply cataloguing evidence in an appropriate way. If a domestic documentation agency is collecting vast amounts of information, one of the most useful things they can do is catalogue this or tag it and sort it in a meaningful way that will assist future investigations and prosecutions.
There are a lot of documentation initiatives at the moment, collecting information pertaining to mass atrocities. What are some of the potential outlets for this information and for organizations collecting evidence of international crimes?
There are numerous different outlets for documentation and information of international crimes, and they run the entire spectrum. We start with the very important advocacy function. National documentation actors can write reports, they can engage the media domestically and internationally, they can provide their findings to other international NGOs or human rights bodies who can shine a light on what is happening, and that is one of the most important things that can be done in the early stages. That is also one of the things that will often galvanize an international response. So in terms of international responses, often in conflict or post-conflict situations, we see that the United Nations may set up a fact-finding mission or a commission of inquiry. And the purpose of those bodies is to take a closer and more detailed look at what happened in a conflict setting, including making some preliminary findings on crimes and potential perpetrators. However, these are not criminal investigative bodies and they are not resulting in criminal prosecutions. But already at that stage, domestic documentation actors play an incredibly important role because they will be one of the main sources of information for those kind of fact-finding bodies. You may also hear of sanctions regimes, and that's another type of regime that can disrupt criminal behavior by having an impact on an individual's ability to move their finances or to travel freely. Again, they are heavily reliant on individuals who have that kind of intimate knowledge of what's happened on the ground. Finally, moving forward, we come to criminal institutions, of which there are quite a range. Most people have heard of the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. We also have new United Nations mechanisms. There's one for Syria and one for Myanmar. And their job is to collect and consolidate all of this information, including that has been documented by national documenters, as well as to conduct their own independent investigations. They then put together evidence and case files, and they can hand that information over to other jurisdictions, whether to the ICC or to other countries. And finally, we come to other domestic regimes who will be prosecuting cases under the principle of universal jurisdiction.